Hi, everybody. Welcome, welcome. We're letting everybody in. Good morning, good morha here in Amsterdam. Buenos dias, bom dia. We're so excited to be here today for the second edition of Coffee and Good Company series. I'm Maria Correa. I'm head of marketing and marketing and communications at B-Lab Europe. And I'm so excited to be starting the day off having coffee with all of you and with our guest, Beth Thoren, who's Director of Environmental Action at Patagonia. Good morning, Beth.
Good morning. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us. So just a little bit of context before we jump into our conversation, and we will leave some time for questions. So please do jump into the chat and say hello and add any questions that you may have. So we're here today to talk about the need for companies to rethink the way that they do business and to play a key role in addressing the societal and environmental issues of today. But to do that at scale and get all businesses on board, we need to really change the system and shift towards stakeholder governance. But there's still a lot of confusion and skepticism and myths around what stakeholder governance and management actually means and how that affects companies on a day-to-day basis. So as part of our newly formed Interdependence Coalition, we're turning to our growing community of B Corps to really learn from them about what it means to run a business with the interests of people and planet first, so we could really build a case with compelling arguments about why every company should behave in this way and how they should be held accountable in Europe and beyond. So when we think about a B Corp that uses business as a force for good and has led the way for over 50 years, it's impossible not to think about Patagonia. So today we're super lucky to be joined by Beth, who joined Patagonia at the turn of the year and has been working in the nonprofit sector with NGOs for over 9 years at Client Earth and with Sea Shepherd, protecting the environment. So she'll be giving us some insight into what stakeholder governance means in practice for a company whose mission statement is, we're in business to save the planet. So Beth, maybe we start talking about that. What does that mission statement mean for Patagonia, and how do you balance the different interests of these different stakeholders?
Right. Well, I'll come back to the mission a bit later, but I can't underemphasize how important that mission statement is to Patagonia. Since we changed it a few years ago, I mean, we'd always been quite an ethical and responsible company, but putting saving our home planet at the center of why we exist as a business has been completely transformative. But I'll come back to that later, because I think what you're asking first and foremost is, how do you balance those conflicting interests, and why on earth would you want to? Actually, it's a lot of work. I won't kid you about that, but it makes a lot of sense. And there's the first is because it's in your company interests. That is why you want to do it. And there is all sorts of statistics around that. If you look, 2019 surveys by PwC and Deloitte, they show that purpose-driven companies consistently grow and profit above industry averages. The facts that I like is that innovation is typically 30% higher and staff retention is 40% higher. So you have a much stronger organization if you are aligned behind a mission. For Patagonia, I mean, I'll go into it, what we do a little bit more later, but our authenticity means that people trust us. They see us as real, and that has benefited us. We are growing 2 to 3 times faster than the outdoor sector. And, that is entirely down to who we are as a brand. And we don't invest a lot into our brand. We invest into being a responsible company. Oh, and sorry, I've just, there were a couple of other reasons I probably should mention as well. So that the authenticity in doing well is one of the key points. The second point is actually innovation. And innovation is what happens is you get a constant tension between profit and trying to do the right thing. And we have a lot of NGOs that we work with, for instance, who think that capitalism is a bad thing. Capitalism is behind the growth, which is destroying our natural world. And that constant challenge to us is really uncomfortable, because we're in the business of selling stuff. And in 2011, we were the first, or we came out with a campaign that said, don't buy this jacket, because we realized actually, you know, the key thing is about buying less and buying high quality and then repairing what you have. And so our whole mindset shifted from selling more stuff to selling just enough good stuff and then fixing the stuff that we needed to do. And as a result, we were the first into this whole area of secondhand product and bringing secondhand product onto our website. And we have that in the US, though not yet in Europe. And it was that push. And again, going back to sort of the enlightened self-interest, you know, the secondhand market is the fastest growing clothes market there is. It's growing, you know, 40% faster than any other market. So we didn't plan that. We didn't know that. We were just trying to do the right thing. So it goes back again to you know, it's in your interest to do this. It's in your interest to do the right thing. And, oh, and by the way, it's what you need to do to save our planet. It's in society's interest. And I guess the way that I view it is when I hope that in a few years we look back on how companies are run today, like on how we look at how people used to smoke in airplanes. I mean, can you imagine people smoked in airplanes? We were breathing that. That's unimaginable. And for me, I find it unimaginable that companies are only responsible to shareholders. Absolutely. You know, businesses live off and benefit from a strong environment and from a strong society, but they have no obligation to protect what they're depending on. They delegate this to the government, and then they often, not always, but often go about undermining the government's ability to do anything about that via lobbying. And I don't think we're going to save the world until we start aligning the interests of business with the interests of government. That is absolutely fundamental. So that's why I think balancing these interests is so important. It's in the company's self-interest and it's in society's interest. Sorry for the long answer.
No, that's what we're here for. Thank you so much. And there's so many things I want to unpack in that. I love the analogy of comparing this to smoking on planes. Indeed, I remember seeing pictures of my parents and being like, what? That's ridiculous. And I think, you know, some of the numbers you talked about the growth of Patagonia, I think it is indeed kind of such a compelling case study for other businesses out there. But as you said, it is challenging. It's challenging to run any business, and especially one that's trying to take into account all the interests of different stakeholders. So the next question I have is, how do you go about embedding that into everything that the company does? And just to note to everybody, the chat is now open. There were some issues initially, so please do chime in there. So yeah, back to the question, how do you embed the interests of these different stakeholders, especially, you know, the environment and the community into everything that Patagonia does?
Yeah, so first of all, for those who don't know that much about Patagonia, what is it that Patagonia does? How does this work? And so we see ourselves as almost two companies in one, a responsible business and an activist business. The key bit, you know, I think is the responsible business. We're the largest supplier of apparel made from fair trade. We have the highest percentage of recycled materials, and we're constantly innovating to minimize the environmental damage caused by our product. And we're working on emissions, and there is just relentless focus on minimizing the damage that we do, because we don't want to grow if we're going to be creating damage to the world. The other thing is and you know, not everybody has to do this, but we give away 1% of our sales to grassroots organizations because we want to be part of driving the change. And you know, it's different for every company, but for us, it was about, you know, very few people support these groups. These groups change the voice and are about people fighting for what they believe in. So we felt very strongly about giving some of our profit away to support those groups. So those are the two things we do. The bog standard, well, it's not bog standard, but you know, the how to be responsible and do the right thing within your business, and then supporting change in the world. And yeah, I mean, just by way of example, we stop coal plants, we stop forests from being cut down. our most recent campaign, we're working on energy communities, which is where communities get together and invest in renewable power. And if they do that instead of suppliers, the money stays within the community and can go to building the community, giving local jobs in the community, and so on. So, you know, I am going to make a pitch and say, I think, you know, the B Corp community should really be involved in this, because it's a lovely way to strengthen communities and drive the change for renewables. But that's the end of my pitch, don't worry.
We're on board.
Going back to like embedding it into, you know, so how did we get to this point? We're doing a huge amount as an organization, and how did we get there? Well, I think I alluded to it earlier, but it's one of the key things was changing our mission statement. You know, we'd always been responsible, but once we put it absolutely front and center and say, you know, Patagonia exists to save our home planet. Its purpose is to save the home planet. Its purpose is not to make money. Its purpose is to survive and be strong and to grow appropriately in order to save the planet. So it has an inherent tension within the mission statement. And that mission statement then got passed down to everybody in the organization, and every finance person and every HR person said, how can you do HR in a world that will save our home planet? Tough question, but actually everybody jumped on it and everybody engaged with it. And I found when I went into Patagonia, that was like, oh my God, everybody I talked to believes this. And I think, you know, it's so interesting the way a colleague described it. You know, I look at every decision 2 times, and she heads up, you know, our e-commerce business. She says, the first thing I do is look at maximizing profit, and then I stop, and then I spend the time and say, now what's this going to do to the planet? And she says, it's so frustrating because everything, you have to do everything twice. But she says, we get to such good decisions, and it's all decisions that we believe in and we feel strongly about. So mission, well, not necessarily, I mean, I'm not saying every business has to do this, but put it central. Don't put it on the side of what you're doing. Don't say, oh, we'll do a little bit of CSR on the side. Say, you know, this is really what it's about. And then I think the other thing is, you know, my role is very senior within the organization, so there's recognition that this is important. The other thing we do is we split roles. So our country heads have a dotted line, our country marketing managers have a dotted line into me and a dotted line into the marketing manager. So they have a dual role. They have to do both. And there's a temptation to get experts and have environmental experts in the market. I don't want to do that. I love this idea that each person has to have that, do that every decision twice. Because then every person is really deep within the organization, owns the mission. And oh my God, does it create passion? Everybody really, really cares. And that's really extraordinary. And then the last thing that we do is we put in place tools, and you know, we're working on what we call an environmental P&L, so we know what the carbon footprint, plastic, you know, etc. of each of our products is. But that's new, and it's going to be great, and it's going to be really helpful. But to be honest, it's much more important to put it in your value system.
Yeah.
That's it.
Awesome. And yeah, I mean, I think you've already touched on so many lessons and advice for other companies. I mean, I think the fundamental thing that I took away is how do you, make it central to everything that the company operates? Because I think, the move away from specialization and to have everybody be held accountable to these interests, and everybody thinking about that in every single decision that's being made, I think is something that every company can kind of take on board. So with that in mind, I mean, you've already talked about so many lessons, but what advice, you know, Patagonia has been around for almost 50 years now, but what advice or lessons that you've learned along the way would you give to companies who are looking to shift towards this model?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think you know, Patagonia is lucky in that we are privately owned. We're a billion dollar company, but we're privately owned. And I appreciate that, you know, most of the people in this audience are not privately owned. So it's much more of a question of sort of influencing and how do you drive this change? And I would go back to starting off with enlightened self-interest and some of the facts that I talked about at the beginning. But, the other things that you can talk about are, climate risk as being a material financial risk. In my role at Client Earth, which is a legal organization, we were working really hard to embed this because financial, finance directors were saying, well, we can't take into account, our duty is to our shareholders. And we had to prove and say, no, actually your duty, if climate is real, and you're not doing your duty if you don't recognize that as a risk. And so that's becoming mandatory, and I hope will become mandatory across the world. And obviously you need a stable society in which to run your businesses. And I think a lot of businesses realized that after the Capitol in the US was stormed, at the turn of the year. So I think there is a growing argument about enlightened self-interest. Perhaps the Shell decision is another example of this. So I would say start there. Push hard to get it to the center of your organization. Patagonia has it in its mission statement. I think there's a really lovely example from quite a few years ago from M&S in the UK. They they created a plan A. So this was just part of their strategy, which was to drive energy efficiency because there was no planet B. There's only a planet A, and by putting it front and center and relentlessly focusing on it, they drove 50 million of profit that they could invest back into the business. And they did that with focus, and they did not know when they start that they would have those results at the end. So I guess go back to, don't mess with this, do it seriously. And then I guess, and then the last piece of advice I would give is stick to what you know. For Patagonia, the heart of what we do is about the environment. We are involved in social justice. We have an important role to play, and we look at that intersection between the two, but at the core, we're driven by the environment. And for other corporations, it might be social justice. You have to find what's authentic to your customers and to your employees. So that would be the advice I would give.
Perfect. And you mentioned just before, we'll do one last question until we get into the Q&A from the audience here. So thank you. Please do add in any other questions that you might have. I'm already seeing some great ones coming in. One last question, you mentioned the Shell case and also talked about, Patagonia being a private business. Instead of going business by business and, trying to change one business at a time and transform and create the transformation that way, why do you think this is, the idea of stakeholder governance and management, why do you think this needs to be elevated to a mandatory requirement at a policy level rather than, kind of a voluntary choice for individual businesses?
Yeah, so a couple of reasons, really. We're facing the biggest crisis of our time, existential with climate change. And then, lurking behind that, we have a biodiversity crisis. But the most immediate screaming one is existential in and of itself. And we need to pull all levers to hit it if we're going to succeed. Business is 75% of global GDP. And what was so interesting about the Shell decision was they said it was very clear from the government's agreement and from the Paris discussions that governments on their own cannot stop climate change. It is cross society, and the businesses have a distinct role and necessity to be involved in this. Otherwise, we will fail in reaching the targets for a 1.5 or even a 2-degree warming state. And therefore, that was the reason they could not take the case that we did not know, or it is the government's job. It is clearly not only the government's job. So if we're going to hit what we need to do in terms of targets, we must include business. So if we must include business, then you say, well, why don't you use voluntary systems? And I would say, yeah, sure. Voluntary systems are incredibly important. They show the proof of concept. They allow you to work through the detail, but inherently they are limited, because people don't, people act really simply because of a carrot and stick, because change is hard. Change is not easy. And people, and I would just sort of ask you, do you know of any voluntary system that has driven systemic change in society? I was racking my head last night and I could not think of one. And I would love it in the chat if you would challenge me on that one, because I couldn't think of any. Lots of great systems that had sort of started change, sure, but actually done system-wide change, couldn't think of any. So, you know, and that's because, you know, it's hard. Change is hard. So you have to put in place structures. And, you know, the current system doesn't make any sense. Capitalism is a very, very powerful system. But, you know, it doesn't protect things like life, clean air, water, topsoil. You know, and right now, you know, we're in this absurd situation where directors are punished. They are punished if they take into account the needs of society. That is absurd. It makes no sense at all. And we must evolve our capitalist system so that the business interests are aligned with the interests of society and with government, and so that our leaders can make balanced choices so that they can act as the parents and the citizens that they want to be. So with that, I will be quiet.
Please don't be quiet. No, I mean, I think I love that challenge. So everybody in the chat, please do kind of chime in if you do know of any voluntary system that's created system-wide change. And on your point of, you know, the carrot and stick and how you incentivize people to work towards this and step away from this model that's kind of punished different leaders for taking into account the environment first. There's a question from Alex on how are the staff targets and how the company measures success? How are those aligned to the company's mission, or are they still commercial, as in volume sold, revenue, profit made? Yeah. Oh,
they're absolutely both. So all of our salespeople have a mission-related target and a sales-related target and a profit-related target and a people-related target. Absolutely, this mission permeates everything we do.
Incredible. So another question is, what are any insights that you might want to share on how you work with your value chain? Are there any tips and tricks for other organizations?
Yeah, this is the nightmare, isn't it? And, you know, even though we're a billion-dollar company, most of the factories that we work with across the globe, we are the smallest buyer. And so actually being small doesn't really matter that much. And what we found was that for each of the factories that we worked in, we had to go and contact all the other buyers from that factory. So a lot of times we're banging on the door of Nike going, hey, listen, at this factory, we need to be doing this. And actually, you know, we find that other organizations are absolutely up for making some of the changes that need to be changed. So I don't think that you should worry about being small. I would, you know, just say work with the other organizations in the channel and go for it. And I think when we think about, you know, how we're going to handle our Scope 3 emissions on climate, we absolutely cannot do this alone. So we are looking at a joint insetting process with other manufacturers, and we're in the process of developing that at the moment.
I mean, the power really is in numbers, right? And what we can achieve collectively. I think that point about collaborating with other companies to create that transformation, not just in your value chain, but also, yeah, in society is such an important one. As we talk about the importance of interdependence as well. So one other question that's come up from Nuno is, can we create a world where climate goals increase share value? Would this make an IPO's metrics changed?
I don't know. That's a great idea. It's certainly, I haven't really engaged with, I haven't thought about something like that. I certainly know that, like, you know, when you look at what Danone did when they were trying to build in the impact of improving, both the impact and the cost of improving the farms where they were getting the product and the soil content within the farms for carbon sequestration. And so they were taking their profit statement and then subtracting the carbon cost of protecting that land for the future. So in a way, what they were trying to do is talk about investing in the future, in protecting that land, and making that very visible to shareholders. And so that's the kind of thing that I have been kind of working with more, rather than what you suggested, but hey, let's go for it.
Open to any and all ideas. Another question from one of my incredible colleagues, Katie Hill. So she's asked, do you have any situations where you've had to balance the interests of different stakeholders? So for example, suppliers' interests against consumer interests, which may be pulling in different directions. And if so, how do you go about those challenges?
Do we have any? Do we have every decision that we have to balance those interests? Yeah, absolutely, all the time. And it's a constant trade-off, and that's what I meant about this dual decision making. You know, we are, you know, another, you know, I was just thinking about a recent example, because we are trying to make ourselves carbon neutral and, you know, drastically reduce our emissions, which costs money. And then at the same time, we're trying to get rid of all polybags in our supply chain. That's getting rid of polybags in our supply chain, upward of 10 million. So we can't make those decisions every day. And so we are having to constantly prioritize and think, okay, what's the next most important thing that we need to be able to do? So, yeah, I don't know what else to say beyond that. It's a constant challenge.
Yeah, and I think the tension you talked about earlier as well is exactly on that point. And I think, again, making it central to everybody's decision making is already kind of a key point in how do you overcome that and making sure that everybody's held accountable to that. There was a question about how far is private ownership a contributor to Patagonia's success? So do you think being privately owned is part of the success and the front role that you're playing? Or do you think that this is?
Oh, it's huge. You know, and it goes back to, you know, the question that Maria asked, which is, why do you need systemic change? Why is it not enough that people do this voluntarily? You know, it's incredibly difficult for a commercial company to do this to the extent that Patagonia had. You know, Patagonia started in the 1970s. The founder was able to invest and invest and invest and reinvest into experimenting and making higher quality product, stuff that didn't damage the environment, and begin to sort of really build a platform. And if he had been held to sort of short-term shareholder returns, that would have been impossible. And that is the tough decision that most business leaders face today, which is what I meant, which is that's absurd. And we have to allow those business leaders to make the right decisions and to make those trade-offs themselves. And we're not in that situation at the moment. So I think, you know, privately owned companies absolutely should take advantage of the fact that they can do this. I think, you know, commercially owned businesses should start that process and begin to integrate it, because it is in your self-interest. But I think it'll only get us so far. And that's why I'm really backing what the B Corp is doing in terms of trying to get this legislation changed.
Thank you so much, Beth. So that's a great segue to talk a bit more about this legislation. So for many of you in the room might already know about this, but earlier this year, the European Commission put out a consultation on sustainable stakeholder governance and what that might mean at a policy level. So back in February at B-Lab Europe, we put together our position on, you know, what we think should be the proposal for the EU, backed by, you know, over 60 different B Corps, talking about, you know, the need to make stakeholder governance mandatory for all companies to take into account the interests of all their stakeholders in their decision making, and to make that, you know, a pan-European directive. So that all companies are held accountable to that. So with that, we're forming the Interdependence Coalition, which we're officially launching in a couple weeks. And we're continuing to hold this Coffee and Good Company series on a weekly basis, So next Wednesday, we're talking to Professor Jaap Winters from INSEAD. So please do join us then. But we also will continue to share, if you follow us on our social channels, on LinkedIn especially, we're continuing to share kind of our perspective and resources, and soon to be launching our website on the Interdependence Coalition to gather more support in more cases for this proposal. So Beth, thank you so much for your time and your perspective and your amazing insights. And thank you to everybody for your time, for joining us so early in the morning for some coffee. I hope you've had a great start of the day. And Beth, I don't know if you have any closing things you'd like to share with the community.
No, just thank you so much to the B Corps B Lab for doing what you're doing. It's super important. Good day, and have a nice rest of the day.
Thank you so much, Beth. Thank you so much to everybody.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Maria.